like put a piece of paper in front of him, says, this is your lunch, just sign here, and basically he does it. So I've got no clue, but
Well, no, I
it's
think
going to be fascinating to watch.
Orange Menace is coming back, I think,
Mm.
one way or another.
Yeah, but I mean, if you hear him speak, he said, we're going to dismantle the deep state and all this kind of stuff. So it wouldn't surprise me if he gets shot. It's going to be really interesting to see what happens between now and November, but so I don't think it's going to be anything good.
Nope. Anyway, we better stop now,
Well,
I guess.
let's think about things more imminently, like the Daily Energy Markets podcast on the 29th of January, 2024, with Brent crude oil trading up now, knocking on the door of $84 a barrel. You got your bull run last week. Omar Najia, global head of derivatives at BB Energy. You called the move a week ago. What's your call this Monday morning? Is this a train that keeps on moving upward?
Yeah. I think basically markets will move higher. People are just kind of, again realizing late that geopolitical risk is massive. So the idea is if oil is going to go up, inflation needs to go higher, which I think is a given because of the US budget deficit and the war spending and the election. And then you also need to have, massive geopolitical risk, which you have now. So it does. There's nothing, unless you're expecting a kind of outbreak of peace in Gaza and everybody hugging each other and all this kind of stuff. It's just not going to happen. It's the world is going. I think that it's going into a much more dangerous kind of phase. I think Israel needs to have a war with invade the south of Lebanon because they need to get all these people that were displaced from northern Israel back home. So they're definitely going to invade. It's only a question of time. I think come 1st of February they're going to go in, and then you have the neocons wanting to do what they wanted to do for a very long time, which is take on Iran. So hence you see all this news stories about Iranian financed and Iranian backed and all the rest of it. So I think the markets are going to go considerably higher from S&P, oil, Bitcoin. The only things I see going lower are bonds in general and the US dollar. So yeah, I think we're bullish. We're going to buy even more now.
Bye. Kate Durian, Meet contributing editor. From an oil markets perspective, Kate, is this now a regional conflict? There was the narrative for so much of the last few months was that it's contained with as tragic as events are in Gaza. From an oil markets point of view, it was a non-story in essence because it was contained and not a threat to energy supplies. Is that now changed? Has that paradigm now shifted? And from an oil markets perspective, this is a regional conflict.
I think it is a regional conflict. I mean, when you've got the US and the UK attacking Houthi targets in Yemen, they're actually in the fight. Now you've had 3 soldiers killed, US soldiers killed in Jordan. How the US will respond, we don't know. It's an election year, but a lot of posturing. I just saw a headline coming in now that the Houthis have now targeted an American warship. I mean, these guys are just not responding to threats, to attacks. And if you look at I mean, they're not a ragtag army. They've got, they've managed to repurpose certain, military equipment to suit their purposes.
But even beyond, obviously, I think the big story over the weekend ultimately is 3 American soldiers killed in Jordan. Ongoing seems military moments in Iraq and Syria and so forth.
So yes, I mean, when you have so much firepower in the region, I kept saying this, the market was too sanguine. There's no disruption to oil supply. Well, I mean, disruption to traffic through the Suez Canal. So you've got, it's 40% down, which is bad news for Egypt. You're going through the Cape of Good Hope, so there's going to be delays. I was actually in France recently, about a week ago, and it was snow on the ground, and the windmills were not turning. So, you need oil and gas. You've got shifts in policy in the US about LNG exports. It's just a very, very uncertain market. And if you look at projections for the year from the IEA and OPEC, they can't agree. Is demand strong? Is demand from China coming back? How much is the Middle East risk factor now playing into it? I think it is. And and it doesn't seem to be stopping anytime soon. The attack on the American base in Jordan, the US has blamed Iran-backed Islamic resistance movements in Syria and Iraq. You can't not respond. I mean, I think that Biden cannot afford not to respond in one way or another, whether he'll respond now or later. But you can't have your soldiers dying in a conflict when they're not really involved directly. They're there at the invitation of the Jordanians, but there's so much anger on the streets, which is sort of not showing. It's not manifesting itself in protests, but it's bubbling beneath the surface. So I think it's a very tense situation.
Dr. Tom Walsh, lecturer in international relations and politics at Northumbria University. First, congratulations on completing your PhD, and timely that Dr. Tom Walsh's PhD was on Yemen and the Houthis in particular. So, Doctor, could you tell us your thoughts on events, how they are unfolding in Yemen, the outlook for how the Houthis might be thinking, what's motivating them, what's the chances of containing them? Your thoughts on all of the above.
I think the first thing to say is that the Houthis, in one form or another, have been at war for 20 years. They're very battle hardened. People think, oh, well, maybe it started with the Saudi coalition in 2015. Well, they fought 4 wars against Saleh from 2004 to 2010, and they kind of enjoy being at war. It's where they thrive. And the Saudis, with UAE and other support, I think it was 25,000 airstrikes the Saudi-led coalition dropped on Houthis and other targets, and they're still just as strong as ever. Now, we're talking about.
I always wondered, Dr. Tom, just so before you go any further on that point, what is exactly a Houthi target? What would it be? Would it be a house? Would it be what is it? The side of a mountain? I mean, when you say a Houthi, what do they go after?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of controversy about that, and the Human Rights Watch reports show that a lot of the so-called targets were spurious at best and ended up hitting civilian targets a huge percentage of the time. Now, I think that the strikes that have happened from the US and the UK have been much more targeted, so they're targeting drones, weapon systems, these kinds of things. But just for a moment on intentions, I think it's clear that there are 2 things going on with the Houthis. The first is that I genuinely believe that they think they're disrupting not just Israel, but supporters of Israel, and they're genuine in their commitment to Hamas and to Palestine. But also, the Houthis are unpopular within Yemen generally. They're very oppressive of human rights and women's rights and other things. But they know that this can get them serious capital, not just in their own country, but abroad as well. Like it's not quite the same, but it reminds me a little bit of the 2006 Hezbollah sort of Lebanon war, where Hassan Nasrallah and Ayatollah Khomeini at the time became the most popular figures across the Arab world and across the Sunni world too. And I think, the Houthis are trying to get a similar style of capital by attacking an enemy that is perceived to be one by the majority of the Arab world,
And with Dr. Tom, with the perspective and perception, the American Fifth Fleet, which is conducting this sort of engagement in Yemen against the Houthis, in every statement they release, it leads with the Iranian backed. They're really trying to put this into an Iranian bucket, the Houthi action. From your perspective and your academic studies, how accurate is that, and how much on a leash do the Iranians have the Houthis on that they could literally make a phone call or not?
I mean, it's very politically expedient to call them an Iran-backed group or a proxy. I mean, Saudi Arabia have been doing it since the very beginning, and that's been a big line of justification for ongoing efforts there. Look, the way I prefer to call them is allies. They're allies of Iran. They have been for a long time. Of course, there is trade. There are Iranian weapon systems that the Houthis control, but in no way or form are they a proxy, in my opinion. They're not at the beck and call of Iran. They have their own agenda and they make their own decisions. Classic one being when they took Sana'a in 2014, that was against Iranian wishes and Iranian advice. And you know, to deny them their own agency is not only to do a disservice, it kind of undermines the accountability they have for these actions, right? And the way they perpetuate their deeply unpopular kind of regressive rule in the north of the country. And let's not forget they control, it looks like a small area, but it's 2/3 of the population of Yemen. So we also need to stop calling them a militia. You know, they're a serious group with serious assets and serious capabilities. They may not have the weapons of America, but they certainly have the will.
And are they comparable to Hezbollah?
I think they're different in one key way, which is that Hezbollah acknowledged Ayatollah Khomeini in a different way, according to Vilayati Faqih. And so they're very close in terms of their theological connections and their ideological connections. The Houthis have a slightly different position. They're Zaydis, and that has a big bearing on their sort of independence. I think Hezbollah are a classic Iranian proxy. They really are aligned and do the bidding of Iran. You saw that in Syria, for example.
Omar, last week we talked, obviously, the sense that, as you had called it, and BB Energy, that this was a market on the upward move. It was a big enough move, $4 over the course of the week. Is that kind of momentum all driven by geopolitics? Is that likely to be as significant this week, Omar?
Yeah. So no, it's not driven by geopolitics. And how do you know? Because basically the news comes late in the cycle. This market's moving up for a lot of different reasons, and I think you have to understand the general kind of background to everything. So geopolitics is one of those things, but geopolitics is not about a vessel here or firing missiles at this or that. Is basically the background. So going forwards geopolitically, forget about oil market's going to go up because of inflation, because of OPEC plus, because of lack of investment, because of all these things. The stuff to do with geopolitics is the strategy. So Israel and the West are locked in to this thing, genocide, whatever you want to call it, going on in Gaza. There is no alternative. If they stop, Netanyahu basically goes to jail because of his, corruption trials, all the rest of it. So he needs to prolong the war, which means he needs to have a war with Hezbollah. If he stops now, Israel has achieved absolutely nothing except winning a war against women and children. So he needs to invade Lebanon, and he needs to invade Lebanon because he needs the Americans to come in on his side militarily, not just supporting him with weapons. And if you're a neocon and you've been dreaming about hitting Iran, and you have a POTUS like you do now, who's not exactly, on the ball, what a great time. You use that basically to go in and hit Iran. Now, all of these things are going to be a disaster. There is absolutely no doubt. But if you think like, neocons or whatever, it's all about arms and money and all this kind of stuff. But in terms of military, the Israel is losing against Hamas. It's going to lose against Hezbollah. And the US is going to get absolutely, punched in the face by Iran. These guys have been preparing for years. The US is just acting on impulse. There is no strategy. Same with Israel. Same with the UK. Look at what's happening in Ukraine. It's a complete and total disaster. So yes, I think basically because of inflation, because of economics, because of deficits, because of all this, oil is going to go higher and geopolitics will help.
Kate, when we look a little bit wider to this sort of Monday morning narrative, China released some stimulus last week. The economy there while not what it was, is still the world's largest oil importer. That the U.S. economy reported a pretty strong fourth quarter GDP growth at 3.3%. I mean, across the horizon, I mean, geopolitics now giving a floor to this thing ultimately, as Omar says, but this is a market that has fundamentals underpinning it. Your thoughts on that?
Yes, I mean, China is very important. And I think what we're seeing also is, I don't know, I think it was one of the digests that you had posted today. There's about 10 million barrels of Russian oil that's sort of waiting out outside. I think it's destined for India, which has become one of the biggest importers of Russian oil. So there's a lot of pieces of the jigsaw at the moment. And I think, yes, Chinese demand, now you've got, the property crisis is back again, liquidating, their real estate company. But I think fundamentally, we haven't seen the sort of bounce. I think jet fuel is one of the biggest components of the barrel. So that hasn't really recovered fully post-COVID. I think we haven't seen sort of a pickup in international travel. So I think that might be the key. And of course, the price of products is going to go up because you've got Russia, whose products exports are going to come down because of attacks on refineries there by the Ukrainians. You've got a lot of the products are now sort of delayed getting to Europe. So I think the products market might be also supportive on a fundamental level. So I think it is a bullish market. I think it's a combination of geopolitics, a combination of disruption to trade routes, tighter sanctions. And I expect that there might even be tighter sanctions against Iran because Iran's been sort of, exporting its oil despite the sanctions. I think we might see even more. Let's not forget that Yemen is going to be even more of a mess than it is at the moment because, the designation of the Houthis as a sort of, specially designated global terrorist means that aid can't go in anymore. I mean, not that the Houthis were allowing a lot of aid to come in because they were controlling it, but I think it's just, when you look at the mess that's going on, when you look at what's happening in Iraq with the US presence, the US armed presence, they're going to start negotiating, maybe pull out. So I think that there's just too much uncertainty for you to say, oh, it's just fundamentals or just geopolitics. I think it's a combination of both. And I think it is, as Omar said, a sort of bullish market, regardless of either.
Dr. Tom, Omar mentioned earlier that in the general scheme of things, US electorate don't really pay great detail of attention even to a storm as large as the Gaza crisis. But in the UK, where does this UK participation in the attack on Yemen, is it a big story? Is it sustainable? Do they have any real contribution to make?
Yeah, well, so Helen Lackner, who's a real expert on Yemen, she said that it made her local news where she is in the UK. So it's trickled quite far down, and it's amazing that suddenly, well, amazing is maybe not the right word. It's extraordinary to see the way in which people suddenly are asking about the Houthis. Who are the Houthis? Where is that Yemen place? And it's taken this for that to happen, not 400,000 people dying via a Saudi-led coalition that was backed by the UK and US all along, and France and Germany and Canada. So the other thing to say is that there's cross-party support for these strikes. So they're pretty unanimous in that respect.
And in that regard, I mean, does the UK have an ability to project forward this scale of power, or is it simply more token support for the US capability? Where does it fall in that regard? And the sustainability of it, I suppose, is really the question. What does success look like?
Yeah, I think the UK likes to overstate its influence continually, and obviously it's much smaller. It's got a very small navy, for example, but there's a big amount of sort of value in the tokenistic sort of support it's giving, of that side of it at least, and that endurance of the so-called special relationship. In terms of objectives, I think they want to really damage Houthi capabilities and resume global trade through that route that's so important, in the Red Sea. I don't think that's going to happen. And I think the way that you get the Houthis to stop is to call for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. And all this will do is embolden the Houthis. If you ask a Houthi what they think of this, they think it's the best thing in the world, because in their words, they're fighting the great Satan, as they'd call the United States. So they say we've only been fighting little sort of evils before, and now we're fighting the big one. That's their words, and they have no problem with it.
Let's go to the survey question, which is sort of looking at this opening question I mentioned earlier. From an oil markets perspective, has the massive Israeli assault on Gaza over the last 3+ months now escalated to a regional conflict? I mean, obviously there is the Red Sea disruption on global trade. There was the ongoing skirmishes in Iraq, the Lebanese border, the Hezbollah issue, and now these 3 American soldiers killed in Jordan over the weekend. I mean, these are all small fires, but from an oil markets perspective, has the massive Israeli assault on Gaza is no longer can be defined as contained and has now escalated to a regional conflict? Yes or no? Get your views on that. We'll post it on social. Omar, looking at the markets from a technical point of view, have we crossed resistance lines, 50-day moving averages intersecting with 200-day moving averages that spur profits for everybody? I mean, where is the technicals in all of this?
No, if you're going to use moving averages, all that kind of stuff, you're not going to make any money at all. So you can't use that. It's not like color by numbers. And, if the little line goes above the
as long as you can fill in the drawing between the lines, you're making money.
Yeah, no. So basically what you got to do is when everybody tells you everything's going to be okay, when you hear like Secretary Blinken tell you like the Middle East is the quietest it's ever been, and you hear that, the US and the UK are going to deter the Houthis. When you hear that, you basically think buy oil, right? Because they've been trying to deter them, like Dr. Tom said, for a very long time, and it hasn't worked. Then when you hear stuff like, the genocide isn't genocide, and you hear, Netanyahu say stuff, and the US says, well, we can't make a determination, you buy oil. When you hear that the US is pulling troops out of Iraq and potentially Syria, you don't think, they want peace. You think they're getting their pieces out of the way before they bomb Iran. So you buy oil. So on that kind of front, and then you look for the little incidentals, like you said, China and stimulus. You look at election and stimulus. You look at US budget deficits and stimulus. And you look at inflation rising and stimulus. So once you look at that, then it's fairly simple. You buy oil and let somebody else come and sell it.
Kate, where does OPEC Plus go? Obviously, this is the beginning of the year. The oil price, for whatever multiple of reasons, is in the sweet spot for them from their perspective. They have further cuts to come into effect this month, this quarter. Where do you think OPEC Plus is going within its role in managing the market?
Well, I think I don't think they're going to do anything now. They've got these voluntary cuts, supposedly 2.2 million, which isn't really a 2.2 million cut, which came into effect in January, goes on until March. So I think they've got some breathing space to see how things go before they have to decide.
But they'll have to prove the proof is in the pudding, right? They'll have to deliver on those.
Yeah, I think they'll have. Well, they will deliver, but I mean, what I mean is that it was a mathematical sort of a game that they played. They said, it's 2.2 million, but some of it was an extension of that 1 million from Saudi Arabia. The other one was from a higher baseline. So there was a bit of
smokes and mirrors.
There was a bit of numbers, yeah, exactly, smoke and mirrors, which they've been doing quite a lot. And I think, and we've seen it time and time again that Prince Abdulaziz likes to keep the markets on edge. He doesn't want the speculators to take positions, long or short. We've seen slight declines in it's not just the price of oil they're looking at, it's also inventories. So, if you get lower inventories because people are having to draw from stocks because they can't get their oil supplies and their product supplies on time, so there's a lot of variables at the moment. But I think for now, I don't think there's going to be any surprises. I think they're just going to, as you said, 83 plus nearly $84 a barrel. They're not really going to rock the boat.
When we think, just Kate, quickly on the news over the weekend, Libya is coming back into the headlines a bit in terms of their determination, capability. Venezuela, of course, came into the headlines in the last quarter. Are these just marginal on the sidelines sort of numbers, or could they be, dial moving, if you like?
No, they kind of add up, but you've also got Brazil coming up now. They're sort of they've joined the OPEC Plus group, not as sort of full members who are going to be reducing their production. They're going to be sort of a bit independent, but there's enough supply in the market, and I think it's not just the supply. And I think this has been mentioned a lot on the podcast. There's a lot of spare production capacity with all these cuts. You're talking nearly 6 million barrels a day of spare production capacity. The problem is most of it is in Saudi Arabia, the UAE, a bit in Iraq. So it's getting it to market. So yes, that provides a cushion and probably will prevent prices from sort of shooting up too much because there is that spare production capacity. But, there's also spare production capacity in Iran. But if there's more sanctions, and Iran has been, targeting also tankers in the Gulf. So I think, you've got two basic choke points that are being affected by this turmoil. So I think for now, I think OPEC will just sort of stay pat and wait for developments.
Stay out of the way, I suppose. Let's get the survey result and give Dr. Tom the last word this morning here. A big, overwhelming yes. This is a regional conflict from the oil market's perspective. Dr. Tom, just sort of taking up that result, but also, this does feel like so many different tea leaves to read on this situation over the last 3 months, that the efforts to contain the Israeli onslaught of Gaza seems to have been the overarching desire of all of the actors in the region, including Iran. But its inability to control its proxies, where do you think that goes from the point of view? Would Iran use muscle to contain this situation on the Red Sea? Where do you see that part of things, the escalating to the regional conflict? And is this Iran proxies sort of out of control or out beyond their control?
I think it's very difficult to predict what's going to happen, but it's likely that things are going to get worse is basically all I'm willing to say on this.
Yeah.
In terms of the proxy stuff, the Houthis, they're doing their own thing. The extent to which Iran are involved in that is spurious and up for debate. In terms of some of the stuff that's happening in Syria and Iraq, I think certainly there's more likelihood of them being more involved there, and with Lebanon too. And Iran is very happy to use those levers and take more of a back seat. But as Kate, quite rightly said, they are being more forward now with seizing this oil tanker. And they're very nervous to get drawn into a direct military conflict that they can't win. So I presume they'll continue in the same way until a time when the US strikes them, which, as Omar says, is looking increasingly likely.
That would be certainly a very risky domino to push over after 40 years of resisting that particular domino. But nonetheless, oil markets trading at 83.71 on Brent, 78.18 on WTI. Incremental moves continuously now over the last week or more as the sort of geopolitical genie has come out of the bottle again. The sort of premium, the geopolitical premium has come back into the oil price. Is it already now $5 or so or more Can it escalate to become $10? Because I mean, the fundamentals of supply and demand are clearly not shifting in any immediate way. But where will the upward elements of this go as these fires join up across the region? Little fires and some big ones, obviously, but if they all sort of come together, conflagrate, then obviously this becomes a much, much more serious situation. So we'll have to wait and see. As spectators, we all are to these much bigger events. Dr. Tom, thank you again for joining us today, and nice to have you back, and congrats again on your PhD. Kate Durian, thank you so much, and Omar Najia, as always, Monday morning. Really appreciate your insights. Have a great week, everybody, and we'll catch up with you every morning at 10:30 UAE time. All the best.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Cheers.